Good evening. Excuse me. Terrible start, eh? Welcome to another Waiheke Media Teacher live stream. This time it was a request for some conversation about the film Get Out. This is particularly for the Level 3 exam on visual text. And we're going to focus on the film Get Out. This we studied in our class at Waiheke High School. And we're particularly going to look at I'm going to look at a couple of documents available to you that are on the NCQA website. And we're going to sort of go through those and have a bit of a look at how you could use these for studying for the exam. I'll put links to these down in the description so you can easily go straight to them. And I think it's important to kind of review, exactly what the markers are going to be looking at as well when they mark your exam, and then we'll have a look at a few of the ideas and things, and how you can hit these things by talking about the film Get Out by Jordan Peele. So let me just switch over to the first document we want to have a look at. And the first one, I'm going to zoom in a bit for you. The first document that we're going to have a look at is an old paper from 2017, and this is the exam as it was offered in 2017. Blah 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 blah. I want to zip down here to the instructions, and we see that discuss the extent. Let me move that. To which you agree with your chosen statement. Respond critically to the statement by making a close analysis of the text. This is kind of a little bit different than anything you've experienced in level 1 and 2 in English. They usually, in level 1 and 2, you usually end up with a question that you have to try and answer. But this one, which is kind of some interesting words, it's discuss the extent to which you agree with your chosen statement. So that means you can either agree wholeheartedly with the statement. You could agree a little bit with the statement, or potentially you could agree not at all with the statement. And there's a couple of things that you can. I mean, if the statement fits an idea that you've been working on, studying closely, then by all means you should just run with it and agree with it, and say why you agree with it, while responding critically. But you could actually say, well, I agree with it a little bit, but I also think this, and that's another kind of way to use the statement as a bit of a springboard for your essay. You can, I suppose, you potentially gives you the option to completely disagree with the statement. I would think that would be fairly unusual, but there may be, it might be that you're faced with a statement where you go, that's just absolute, rubbish in the context of my film, and I'm going to show you why. And so it's a possibility that you could not really agree with it at all. I'd probably tend to shy away from that one in case something really jumped out at you, and I'd either pick wholeheartedly agree with it or agree with it, but there's also this. And respond critically to the statement by making a close analysis of the text. Respond critically by making a close analysis of the text. Well, analysis we know from level 1 and 2 is a close reading. putting a microscope to this film and really picking it apart, using all the things that we've sort of addressed in the past. So cinematographic techniques, things like the narrative structure of the film, if it has a unique sort of structure to it. We could use characters. We could use setting. And I think you should always sort of address a theme that comes across in the film, and that's probably how I think of that as being sort of an overall kind of a sort of a framework that you might kind of use to sort of hold your essay together as to talk about a theme. And a lot of these films that you're watching at this point have very strong themes in them, and it's quite possible that if you've done some other work earlier in the year, particularly around some of the internals, where you've done some close analysis, and you've probably done some critical analysis by using secondary sources. And so I would be, whilst studying for this exam as well, I would be looking at what other people say about this film, and particularly what other academics and more critical voices around the film. So I'm not just looking at sort of your average blog post. I'm not a review. Reviews tend to have just a very minimal kind of a critical view on a film, and so I would probably be looking for something we did some work around the EPIC database that you can look at and see if you can find at least one or two other sources, but might give you some critical perspective on your piece. So I'll put a link to all of these to this I'll put a link to where all of the old exam papers are, so you can look at that. Now, the next thing I wanted to look at, and this is a little bit harder to find, and I will definitely make sure I link this one up, is this is an assessment schedule. So this is kind of a marking schedule for the marker to probably have in front of them while they're marking these papers. So what I want to do is I want to look at the excellence criteria, which made me think of this whakatoki that's kind of popular Māori whakatoki. Whaia te iti kahurangi ki te tohu koeme he maunga tea, which means if you're going to bow down, you might as well bow down to a lofty mountain. And in our case, our lofty mountain is the excellence. If you're going to go for it, go for the excellence. I mean, you can only if you're shooting for to doing all of what's in the excellence criteria, then if you don't hit it, you're only going to go down. Whereas if you're just sort of shooting for this and you don't hit it, you don't have anywhere to go. So shoot big here on this one, and let's go for the excellence. I'll zoom in a little bit for you, and I'll put a link to this one because this is quite a valuable thing. And so let's see what they want for an excellence. And excellence is to respond critically and perceptively to specified aspects of studied visual oral text with supporting evidence. And it involves making sophisticated and insightful and or original responses to the aspects, integrated with accurate and relevant evidence. The argument may include an explanation of how significant aspects of the text communicate ideas about context, such as the human experience, society, and the wider world. Okay, so we know we have to be critical. We've kind of got a little bit of that earlier. And perceptive means to sort of show a little bit of deeper insight, right? It's not just surface stuff we're looking at. We want we're looking for people who dig a bit deeper into the text, sort of go beyond the text. And supporting evidence, we know a lot of that. That's the sort of things we're talking about, the quotes or references to scenes or cinematographic techniques, etc. Original responses, blah, blah, blah. Integrate. So they want an essay. They want a nicely structured essay. This is where your planning comes in really important. If you do 15 minutes of planning before you actually write this out, hopefully you can get an accurate and relevant essay that looks like an essay and reads like an essay. So, okay, let's dig a little bit deeper into this. They give a list of specified aspects here on the thing, and we know a lot of these. Purposes and audience. I might actually start talking a bit about Get Out now. So, purposes and audiences. With the film Get Out, we know that while the film is sort of pitched at a very wide kind of generic audience, it's a sort of a horror film. Horror films are one of the most popular genres of film that you can make these days. So the audience is quite wide, but we also know from watching the film and analyzing it and discussing it in class that Peele's looking to make a film which definitely appeals to a black audience, but also has a different message for the white liberal audience that he's also sort of trying to actually attract into this film. So he's kind of, its purpose can be seen as being different depending on who the particular audience is in this film, and that could be something I think that's nice to comment on. It gives you a little bit of, I think that's kind of an insightful notion to have, that there's a sort of there's two audiences, and those audiences have different purposes. That Peele's purpose is different for each audience. Ideas is another one of the aspects that you can talk about, and that's character, theme, and setting. You can write about all of those for Get Out. There's some very strong characters in here. There's Chris. There's the Armitages. There's some very interesting themes around race, around the idea of a post-racial America. We talked about a variety of themes as well in class, but mostly it's around about race in contemporary America, and particularly white liberals, how they view themselves as being sort of living in a sort of a post-racial society now that they've had a black president. We talked also about the setting as being this house out in the kind of countryside, and the house has a very kind of a colonial style house, off in the woods type thing, which is kind of a cliche of horror films. But I think you could also introduce some ideas in the setting of the party itself, whether the sort of the bingo style auction for Chris as part of the setting. You might even possibly talk about the sunken place as a kind of a setting as well. And that's definitely also fits in with this idea. Language features, they've got cinematography, mise-en-scene, editing, production design, sound performance, and rhetorical devices. Well, I think for this one here, if you were to talk about these, I'd probably be talking about the use of symbolism. The film, as you know, on a couple of viewings, many things end up kind of resonating with you, which they don't the second time around, which they don't the first time. So symbolism would be something in there. Mise en scene is could be talked about in there, how there's the house is filled with photographs on the wall, and some of these photographs add a certain dimension to it. The way it's set up with the kind of operation room down the bottom, but a little bit difficult. I think not particularly a strong aspect of this film. Performance, again, I find that quite difficult to talk about. But you could talk about Chris, I suppose. But mainly, I think for this film, we look at symbolism, possibly even suspense, structures, narrative sequence, beginnings and endings. Yeah, not so much for this film. Okay, so I'm going to move down and look at this thing. This sort of thing here, I'll see if I can zoom it in one more for you. This is kind of what you need to do to get an excellence or a merit or an achieve. So we're just going to focus down on this area here, these kind of this E. This is the kind of excellence column. So we'll look down there. And the first one says, shown to look at this E7. Show some insight and perception about a specified aspect of the text and how it relates to the rest of the text, or to other contexts such as the human experience, society, and the wider world. Oops, where's my thing gone? Okay, so that is that's a way you can. So that's a generic kind of insight and perception, and how it relates to the text and other contexts such as human experience, society, and the wider world. Okay, well, let's have a little bit of a conversation about that. We do know a lot about Get Out and the human experience. The film is addressing the very real experiences of many African Americans, or probably all African Americans. That of racism, and a kind of a structural racism, and a real sort of subtle, or not so subtle kind of commentary from white people about their race. And the film is peppered with this. There's one point, there's a reference, there's references from the from the crazy Armitage brother about Chris's sort of natural physique. There's one of the white ladies at the kind of the party sort of makes a slightly veiled reference to Chris's sexuality, and there's the Mr. Armitage's quote to Chris about, I know what you're thinking, about all the servants, and this thing about I would have voted for Obama a third time. All these, there's a whole bunch of little references to the experience of black people living in a white world. And we did actually, if you go back through some of the notes, if you were in class the last couple of weeks, we made reference to this notion by W.E.B. Du Bois about the sort of two selves that black Americans have to sort of live within. And one was the self that they are amongst their own community, amongst their own people, and the other one is the self that they have to present when they're existing in the wider world, dominated by white people. And so the human experience for many of the audience, the director, and the person in the film, Chris, you have some insight and some perception about that. And that would be one of the director's purposes, to point out these experiences that black people go through on a day-to-day basis. The film itself is a social thriller, and so social thrillers are a kind of a style of film that where societal norms and values are examined for their horrific implications. So that's partially what's going on here, and there's a variety of other films that have done similar things, and often sort of the deeper horror films are looking at how societal norms are kind of can create these horrific situations. So that's another aspect that you could look up. You can also connect the film to go beyond the film. We did some work on looking at how the film related in the context of blaxploitation films. So there's a history of horror films made by black people, and it starts off with some early blaxploitation horrors. Particularly, we looked at the film Blackula, and on a few. I'll put a link to this text. This is a secondary source that we read about blaxploitation horror films and how they function in society, and how they kind of are historically located and deal with sort of issues that are historically relevant at that particular time. So having a read of that could be really good as well. I'll put a link to. Actually, I don't know if I will put a link to that because I think it's probably a copyright. But you should have that in your own Google Drive. And that text is called Blaxploitation Horror Films: Generic Reappropriation or Reinscription, and he talks about how the subject, the monster, is usually a racialized monster in horror films, and then how blaxploitation directors and black directors have actually sort of flipped this notion of the monster around, and we could see that sort of happening in Get Out, where the monster is actually white liberals are the monster, which sort of plays in with the tradition of racializing the monster, usually as a black figure of some sort or a racial other. So in this case, it's still sort of a racial other. It just happens to be a white other. So that sort of ties back to this purpose and audience. So you could have a look at that. The one I've put in the for you on Google Drive has a lot of highlighted areas. The yellow are sort of important parts of it and of the text, and then there's also some sort of vocabulary words that are highlighted in green, so like institutionalized racism. So yeah, I would have another look. That's another way to make this link out to the wider world and get into this point of where you're starting to develop insightful and interpretations of the film. Okay, so those are the sort of that really is sort of looking at how it relates to other rest of the text, to other contexts such as human experience, society, and wider world. That's kind of my key to getting up to the E. See if you can do that. What else we got? Demonstrates maturity and insight into evaluating the text in terms of the statement. Okay, so remember for this one, you're not just rabbiting on about the text. You've got to actually sort of come back to the statement and show to the extent that you agree with it. So keep sort of coming back to that statement. Shows insight and engagement with the text and may link successfully to context outside of the text. For me, that part there may link successfully to context outside of the text. That's your secondary sources. So if you can quote something about blaxploitation films, or if you can if you have a secondary source and you can make reference to it, that's demonstrates to me a real maturity and engagement with the text. Makes a judicious personal response to the text, demonstrating some critical insight and appreciation, and move beyond the text. So we're pretty much doing that. Makes mostly accurate use of academic writing conventions in a response that is articulate and shows some originality of expression. I'm going to combine that with the next one, which says writes a cohesive, deliberately planned response with scope and focus. This is kind of your essay. I mean, is your essay readable? Is it structured in a kind of a logical way with paragraphs? Does it have kind of like thesis type statements at the beginning of the paragraphs? Does it have are those thesis statements or topic statements supported by evidence? Does it use fairly accurate language, structure, and syntax? You need to be able to, at this point, write well-structured paragraphs and have an essay that is planned out with an introduction, as many body paragraphs as you need, and a conclusion. They're looking for that as well as the all of the above. Provides insightful detail and evidence woven into the response that supports the discussion. This kind of thing comes up again and again with the excellence, this kind of weaving in of the evidence. So that's like weaving in quotes, or sort of introducing your secondary source as well, by tying it into a previous idea. Just trying to not sort of having like just a separate paragraph on your secondary source and a one paragraph on Jordan Peele, so trying to kind of integrate a lot of these things together in a kind of a fairly seamless way. So I think that's a useful thing to have a look at, and something that you may not have seen before, but definitely worth having a look at what they're looking for, what the marker is going to be looking at while they're marking your text, and I'll put a link to that as well down below. So let me see what we got. Okay, so I think that's really what I'm going to leave you with for tonight. The film, I would encourage you to particularly have a look at some of the notes and things that we had created in class, and particularly have another look at this. I would have a look at the blaxploitation secondary source and see if you could, grab a couple of ideas from that which you can use in your own response. That will really I think that'll really go a long way to showing you that you have some insight and perception, and a certain maturity of engaging with a text on a level that is not just at the surface, and is not just sort of talking to your peers or the teacher, and is really going beyond and seeing the text in a wider context of maybe a historical continuum of black horror films. So definitely do that, and then have a good notion of some of the stronger aspects of this film. So the use of symbolism, the way that the characters that are kind of these subtle cliches of white sort of liberal racist remarks and commentary. I would be looking at doing some analysis on what is the sunken place. What does it represent for a black audience? There's some writings out online about what the sunken place, how to interpret the sunken place, particularly this word woke as well. You might want to have a look at that. The trouble with online looking up Get Out is there is a lot of stuff on it, and a lot of it's sort of not particularly critical, just so, weaving your way through some of these things. So having just, it's a fairly, I think you're gonna need to wait until you get in the exam to see what kind of the questions are. Oh, there's Aiden Andrews. Aiden, you're not even doing this exam, so... But thanks for tuning in anyway. I didn't look over any of the questions but I'll put a link down there before. I think it's a good idea to kind of get your, you could even just do a little bit of a quick, okay, this is how I would agree with this statement. Okay, this is how I would agree with this statement in regards to Get Out, and just sort of practice kind of having quick responses to text. Like I've said in earlier pieces. I'm just responding to Aiden there. As I've said in a previous stream, I'm just going to see if I can focus myself a little bit. I tend to use a little bit of the pressure of the exam setting to drive me forward. So I don't really agree with the idea of doing practice essays, or not so much a practice essay, but trying to memorize an essay. I think you're better off just having a good knowledge of some substantial themes, ideas, some of these aspects, being prepared for kind of what sort of questions you're going to get, and maybe that's even practicing some of these, to what extent you agree or disagree, practicing a few of those. But I wouldn't go and write a big essay on one of the statements and hope that I just get a statement like that. Use the sort of the tension of the moment to kind of drive you forward, and be confident that you know enough at the moment to get you through. I think that this film is a good film for almost any of these questions or any of the statements that come up. I mean, there's some clear themes. It's contemporary. It's very relevant to society, particularly American society today. And I think you can write a good response to it. And if you can locate it historically, like I said, in that continuum of blaxploitation and black directors doing horror films as well, I think that's an added benefit to get you towards the excellence. Okay, if you have any more specific, if you have any questions, you can feel free to chuck those in the comments, and I will try and answer them over the next couple of days. I know the exam is on Wednesday, so good luck with the exam. Check out the Google Drive through Google Classroom for some resources, and shoot for that excellence. Okay, so good luck on the exam. Once again, kia kaha.